There we go. So 2 weeks ago, which feels like a whole lot longer than that, but 2 weeks ago, we made it through a whopping 10 verses. And so therefore tonight we are ready for Exodus 23, verse 20. Is that what you guys got? All right. So with that, my first paragraph is 20 and 21. So we'll hop in from there. Behold, I send an angel before you to guard you on the way and to bring you to the place I have prepared. Pay careful attention to him and obey his voice. Do not rebel against him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. Big shift from what we had been looking at. What do you think?
What does that mean? His name is in me.
My name is in him. Well, I want to look at something real quick because I'm curious.
Okay, I know I'm on medication, but I assume that this is God saying this.
So God is saying this, yes, through Moses to the people. That's what we've been looking at up to this point. So I'm going to, I did not talk to Dana about this week, and now I'm regretting that I didn't ask him to be on the call, but I think I want to push a little bit and just say that this is one of the things we run into, and I guess I need to have this conversation tonight. We've talked about this before. Angels sometimes are spiritual beings, and sometimes angels are physical people. The word is a messenger. And so I think probably in this instance, does anybody's not use the term messenger or angel? Does anybody's not say it's an angel? My gut right now, without going further into this, is that he's probably talking about Moses. That I have sent my messenger to guard you on your way, to keep them heading in the right direction, and my name, God's name, is in him. That's the language we use in the New Testament for the Holy Spirit being in us. It's the language that's used specifically in the book of Revelation, where it talks about the angel of the church in Philadelphia. It's talking about the preacher, the person who's leading that group. And so my gut right now would be to say, this is probably Moses, and it's God affirming that he is in Moses and he will lead the people through Moses's actions. Does that make sense? I'm about 90% certain. I'm always leery because we may read something here in just a little bit where we're literally dealing with an angel of the Lord, a spiritual being. We know, I know Jim and Diane aren't here tonight. It's Jim's job typically to jump ahead, but in the book of Joshua, we see the angel of the Lord standing on the other side of the Jordan after they've crossed. And Joshua gets confronted with the spiritual being. And Joshua's like, are you for us or against us? And he goes, neither. But as the leader of the Lord's armies, I am here to do the Lord's work. And Joshua's like, okay, then now we're on your side. So it could be that kind of an angel. It could be Moses. But right now, my context is leaning more towards he's talking about Moses. Does that make sense? If it is Moses, I find it interesting in 21 that there's this call to do not rebel against him, which they do rather frequently. I mean, again, that's a little bit of jumping ahead, but
Every other chapter.
feels like it, yeah.
I wonder what made God think he had to say that this time.
Well, I think,
Because like you said, it's not like they haven't been
they've been rebellious all the
back
time.
talking the whole time.
This is, I think that the key difference here is if this is Moses and God, remember, this is the same conversation from when God was speaking from Mount Sinai and giving the Ten Commandments. This is the exact same discussion. This is one long conversation. And so I think there's a certain degree to where God is saying, after the people asked God not to speak directly to them, but speak through Moses. And I'm certain that there's probably a sense in which there's the rumbling up on the mountain and the thunder and lightning, and Moses hears it, and he's relaying the message to the people that they still need to hear. Moses is still my guy. And even though you've grumbled against him up to this point, understand, don't do that moving forward. It's only going to. I got this picture as I was saying that the notion that you often saw in TV shows or movies where you're taking a long car trip with the kids in the back, and they're always going, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" You know, and all of a sudden you got to pull over the car and deal with it, and all it does is make us not get there yet faster. So every time there's a rebellion, every time there's I don't want to say frivolous complaint, but every time that there's a frivolous complaint, it means that they're not going to get where God wants them when he wants them to get there. Does that make sense? And so I think that there's this reiteration. If this is Moses, I think this is a reiteration. God is saying, follow him. And Amy says, isn't God speaking through Moses here? Yeah. So in some ways, Charles, I don't know if you've had one of these moments. I've had a couple of these where you really feel like God's giving you a word to say, and then all of a sudden you got to say something that says, listen to me. You know, God, do you really want me to say that? I mean, yeah, I know I'm speaking on your behalf, but okay, yes, listen to Samuel. He knows what he's talking about. That's what God says. Kind of one of those moments. Unless there really is a spiritual being that's here.
I think we did that whistle stop.
Okay. I'll let that sit.
Please do.
The other side of it is, now I'm going to go back and play the other advocate. If this is a spiritual creature, spiritual being, then I probably want to say it's probably in line with the pillar of cloud and fire that they're supposed to follow. That is God's lead for them. They have that up until the moment that they enter into the Holy. So if it's that person, if that is the spiritual being that is their messenger, that is the one that they are following, then it's when the pillar of fire and cloud moves, you better be moving. Follow it. Regardless of it. That's, woohoo. So regardless of who God sends, we should, the moment we can acknowledge that it is God who sent them, then we should do our best to follow that person. Anything else? It was a little bit self-serving to say that. I hope that I'm the person worth following. All right, we'll move on. 22. But if you carefully obey his voice and do all that I say, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. What do you think?
I find it interesting, the fact that he says, listen to him, but do all that I say. In other words, you're listening to him, but you're following me. Better make sure it's me saying this.
And I think that that's important, and that's why I find myself regularly saying that notion, what Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. So this is, God's almost saying, this is my guy, and you follow him, but make sure you're following me. You're not really following him, you're following me through him. And so long as you follow me,
Then
then you're okay. And not only are you okay, but I'll be fighting on your behalf against your enemies and your adversaries. Anybody really want to fight against God? Considering since he wrote the rules, he can kind of play around the rules. Any other thoughts? Ooh. The next one's long. I have 23 through 33. All right, you ready? When my angel goes before you and brings you to the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites, the Hivites and the Jebusites, I blot them out. You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do as they do, but you shall utterly overthrow them and break their pillars in pieces. You shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water, and I will take sickness away from among you. None shall miscarry or be barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. I will send my terror before you and will throw into confusion all the people against whom you shall come. And I will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. And I will send the hornet before you, which shall drive out the Hivites, the Canaanites, and the Hittites from before you. I will not drive them out before you in a year, lest the land become desolate and the wild beasts multiply against you. Little by little I will drive them out before you, until you have increased and possessed the land. And I will set your border from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates. For I will give the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them and their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. So what do you think?
Pretty sweet, they don't have to do anything.
God's plan A is they don't have to do a thing.
But.
No, but that's God's plan. If they follow him and do as he says, they just have to live their life, be fruitful and multiply, and he will give them the land that they need.
I'm wondering why he said little by little, so the animals don't overrun you, but you almost think he'd have a plan for that.
I think that there's a sense, as I read this, I get the sense that even though this is a large group of people, if they move into the land and all this land that he's talking about, we're talking about from the Red Sea all the way up along the Mediterranean Sea, all the way over to the Euphrates River. Time for that.
Yeah, I was just.
far more than they ever thought.
From the Red Sea, along the Mediterranean Sea, all the way to the Euphrates River. All of this was meant to be theirs. How big did Israel become at its best? Right there. That's it. They never actually completely conquered the land. But they weren't supposed to conquer the land, were they, according to this? They would move in and God would give them the ground that they needed. And so I think there's this notion where if he had driven everything out all at once, they would just get scattered and they wouldn't be a single people anymore. They would get isolated into their little pockets and families around, and they would be easier for these other nations to influence them and pull them away from God. And so you have this notion where God is saying, as you grow and multiply, I will continue to drive out the people who are not following me. I will drive out the people who are not worshiping me, and you will have everything that you need. Is this a group of warriors at this point? They fought a battle, and they probably won primarily because they had more people, right? And of course, there's a whole Aaron and her holding Moses' arms up thing. God fought on their behalf. But realistically, is this a conquering army that's going into the land?
Their families.
Their families, they're at best, what, 2 months out of slavery? Are they really a fighting group to take the land? And God's saying, not only are you not that, but you don't need to be that.
So what's the symbolism of the horn?
I wonder if somebody's gonna ask that question. What verse is that?
It was 20,
28.
Oh, there is. We have a footnote, I guess.
What's your footnote say?
I can't pronounce that one word.
The meaning of the Hebrew for this word is uncertain. The Septuagint translation of the Old Testament renders it wasp, but the translators may have been guessing. In any event, the Lord promises to send some agent to disable or frighten the peoples of Canaan so that they will not be able to resist Israel's invasion. But probably the word involves concrete imagery, and the focus of the statement on the effects. Therefore, we are not to look for some historical agent to which the word metaphorically refers.
That's a nice, convenient answer, isn't it? It means something that we know was really important to the people today, but it probably doesn't mean as much to us. All of a sudden, I had this notion as I was thinking about it, this is God's hornet, probably, and they kind of allude to that in the note, not necessarily hornets like we're at, what was it, a couple of years ago, we had the murder hornets? So now imagine how big a God hornet would be. Can you imagine a hornet this big? Would that cause you to flee a little bit? With a stinger probably about that long? It might cause me to run. I mean, I know that if you go forward into the book of Revelation, it even kind of uses some of that same imagery for some of the beasts and creatures that are talked about there. So it could be that this is just a hornet, which are still big enough. I mean, hornets leave them alone and they will leave you alone. Mess with them and you're in serious trouble. Especially if you get into a hornet's nest, and then you're in real trouble.
hers says.
Mine says pestilence, not hornet. Now that's interesting. Yours just says terror. So it's clear that they're not 100% certain what this word means. Athetro. But what we know is it is God's agent that will cause those who are not of him to flee. I'm kind of concerned about pestilence as a translation of that, because a disease or a pestilence, I don't tend to think of that as something that causes people to run and flee. They tend to cloister. I mean, think of what we just went through, right? We just kind of hunker down and don't let anybody else in or around us. The way it's described is this is something that is going to cause them to say, nope, we're not living in this place anymore. What you think?
This says panic, send panic.
send a panic. So, yeah, it would,
More like ensued chaos when.
I don't know if I would say it goes all the way to chaos, because chaos is people running in all different kinds of directions.
Panic, I mean.
Yeah, there's a notion of panic, but you almost get a picture of more like what I would think of as a forest fire, where the fire is coming at you and there's only one direction to go, and that's away. So it might be more like, man, I'd hate to see that. I've seen the videos. I've never experienced one of a swarm of locusts. Remember, we talked about that back in the beginning of the book. But could you imagine a swarm of hornets? That might cause me to not want to stick around.
It's almost when you hit like a hornet's nest or something and they start to lose.
Yeah.
Crazy.
It's bad enough going through a thing of gnats.
Yeah. We tasted. But yeah, imagine instead of running into a swarm of gnats, you got a swarm of hornets. And then if they're not regular hornets, if they're God hornets, yeah, no, I'm pretty sure that I'd be going in the other direction.
It'd be interesting, the fact that maybe God didn't want this word specifically nailed down, because this way would force them to think about what God's doing and not the agent God's doing. Kind of like the thorn in the flesh Paul talks about. We're not given it because that way we can't say that, oh, ours is different. We just know, hey, God can take care of it.
So to that end, also though, causes me to think that the angel that we've been talking about, even back to 20, is probably not Moses. This probably is a spiritual being that is leading them forward. Because otherwise, you wouldn't have, I don't think Moses's job is to go out and send the hornet. No, I mean, he had that staff and there's a whole legacy thing and the plagues from Egypt, but I'm willing to admit that maybe I'm leaning more towards the spiritual side now instead of just a human agent here. What else do you notice?
You think some of the reason why they didn't cover the area you planned on, that maybe they didn't multiply like you thought they would?
Well, I think part of it is the fact that they were never fully embracing God's will means that they were constantly in wars and people were killed and they were constantly being taken as slaves and they weren't allowed to reproduce and that we know of, there really isn't this sense that they ever fully lived into what God had in store. He made them a promise. If you follow my decrees, right? You're not going to get sick. There's not going to be miscarrying. You're going to have the fullness of your life, which 120 days, 120 days, 120 days. More than 120 days, yes. 120 years is what God said. Could you imagine how different society would be if everybody lived a full 120 years? What could be done? A healthy 120 years.
It's a long time.
I mean, to your point about, multiplying and having the kids. I mean, there are people who continue to have kids into their 50s. Some of my friends from high school are just now having their first kids in their 40s. Thinking they're crazy, but that's glad we decided to start young and everybody gave us a hard time then. But imagine if people were living long, healthy lives and continued to have kids and were like, Jacob, who had 12 sons, it was normal. And there was peace and God didn't have the diseases and they didn't have miscarriages.
But we kind of talked earlier in Genesis that they lived so long because they needed to populate, where now we're populated. I mean, in 120 years, maybe, even though that was the promise, is we don't have very many people that live, rarely do they get even to 110. I mean,
Yeah.
that's pretty rare,
100 is rare.
yeah.
It'd be interesting to
What's the
see.
guy in the news that always did smokers? Oh,
On,
well,
Willard Scott.
yeah, we've had them over 100, we have had the.
Yeah.
You know, you see that some that are 106 or, you know, getting there, but rarely, but maybe it has to do with the fact that we have a lot of people in the world.
I think that there's probably some of that, but again, what's the promise here for those who follow him? How many of the people in the world today actually follow him?
And I was kind of sitting there thinking, okay, he's part of the C4, you know, he's done all these things, you know, he's shown himself and they're still keeping, as you talked about, if you get him too close to borders and other people are gonna bring him in that have all those other guys and, you know, and they're gonna be susceptible and all this, and I'm thinking, how do they not see this plan? But how do we not see the plan? We're still there.
Preach it.
Yeah,
You know, God just keeps handing them greater and greater pictures of what he wants. And all they gotta do is just keep saying yes to it. Yet we know they don't. And to your point, like you said, today, God keeps giving us greater and greater pictures of what he wants for us and what he wants for your life. And some days we do pretty good and most days we don't. And so, and we have the fullness of the Holy Spirit dwelling within us. So in some ways, it's easier to cut them a little slack because they have the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit's there. The breath of life is in them, you know, but they're not, and they're seeing the miraculous. But that was yesterday. God, what are you doing for me today? But that never happens, does it?
et cetera, et cetera.
And hold up the mirror.
Yes, exactly.
Anything else you notice in this long paragraph that you want to ask about?
I'll open the can of worms.
Okay, open your can of worms.
This is where some people say, oh, God's just a bigot. Because he doesn't want these other people in with
So
the other races with them. That's what some people say.
one of the key realities that we have to remember is God does not prefer any ethnicity, tribe, or nation over any other. Period. All of us are made in the image of God. All of us are loved by God. But the difference here is these nations, and like most nations of this time, are defined as a separate nation by the gods they worship. Today, you could be an American Christian, an African Christian, a Russian Christian, a Chinese Christian, an Australian Christian. Our nationality doesn't affect our faith. You can be an African American Christian, you can be a Caucasian Christian, a Pacific Islander Christian, a Native American Christian. Our ethnicity does not affect our faith. But at this point in time in human history, nationality and religion went hand in hand. Chris Carr, wasn't he giving them an opportunity to change? I think absolutely so. And Amy says, but he talks about the people not following these other gods. And I think that's the whole point. He will drive out the people who choose not to worship him, who choose not to follow his way. And that's been the plan all along. He wants one people. All tongues will confess that he is the Lord. And I think that that's where, in some aspects over the last couple hundred years, the church has gotten things wrong. We require people to not only accept our faith, but you got to accept our nationality and our culture with it. And that's not what it says at all. The Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites They all had different gods. The Canaanites were notorious for their gods. And most of these gods, for the record, we've seen time and time again through historical and archaeological facts, many of these gods required human sacrifice as a part of their worship. A number of them that God is incredibly against and speaks out against regularly don't just require human sacrifice, but infinite sacrifice. Amy Phillips says, and even then, the culture nationality was not necessarily inclusive. God always has believers, even within these cultures. And yeah, you know, that's why I've said all the time, I don't think God chooses sides, even in war, because there are believers on either side of the battle. Good God-fearing people can be conscripted to fight, whether they want to or not. Good God-fearing people have volunteered for fights, thinking they were doing something good and right. That's why you gotta, going back to what you said earlier, make sure that the guy you're following is God's man or God's woman. So I don't think it's ever has been or ever will be an issue of God's racist or, you know, we're xenophobic. It's not about fear of the other, or the reality is there is no other. We are all human beings. We are all made in the image of God. The difference is whether or not we serve God. Is there another message that I missed? Unless it went like this, I thought maybe there's.
I was gonna review red bottom or not.
Yep. Sorry, Charles, that wasn't as much a can of worms as you thought it was.
Oh, I didn't think so, but I thought I'd bring it up for those who do make it one.
And there are a lot who want to make that a big deal.
And I get that, because it does kind of have a us against them feel to it.
There is a little bit of that. But we have to remember the context of what the us versus them is. Those who follow God and those who do not. Anything else?
In God's plan, even today, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and rulers of darkness. God wasn't initially calling them to fight at all. He was the one doing it.
How does that change things? To think that God wasn't going to call them to fight at all. Does it? I mean, we know ultimately 40 years from now, they're going to enter the promised land and they're going to have to fight every single place that they go. I don't know, it's a trick question. It causes me to pause.
Or like I made the comment that maybe they didn't reproduce, maybe they did have the people to take over the area he wanted, but the bad kept pushing back and Israel ends up where it's at today. I mean, because is there any proof that they got all the way to the river?
No.
So, I mean,
In David and Solomon's day, they kind of cover a bigger chunk of this area up here. They take a big slice on the other side of the Jordan River for a while.
but the bigger part at the bottom, we never.
But, and for them to go all the way down even to the Red Sea, they never really fully taken. In fact, when we hopefully we'll get there, but when we get there, it talks about Dan's tribe was supposed to take land by the sea. And they couldn't cast out the people who were there. So instead they just go and they move up into the northern part. They take an easier spot. They don't take the ground that they were given, and instead they just kind of go dwell somewhere else. And so you get these stories where God says, I want you to have this. And they're like, maybe not.
Let's turn here and go that way.
Those hills over there look a whole lot easier to hold than that one there, so.
Trying to.
The question I find myself asking is, there is a perennial question amongst believers about should we be pacifists or not? Conscientious objectors. There are many denominations who require that as a part of their faith. Jesus says, turn the other cheek, right? Don't strike back. Don't act out. It seems like you could read from this passage, God's plan is that none of us would need to be anything but conscientious objectors. If we would truly follow him, there would be no need for battles and wars.
Angels, Quakers, and Mennonites.
Yeah, the Quakers and Mennonites, prime example. The Seventh-day Adventists are another big group that does it. I'm not saying that we should be pacifists, but I can see a case for it. Does that make sense? That if we genuinely were following God's lead, there wouldn't be a need for it. Yes, sir.
I was also thinking this wasn't just one person or a couple of people following God's lead. This was the nation following God's lead.
How many did we say? A little over 3 million people? If you actually had a community of 3 million people who were genuinely following God's lead, do you think that would maybe take some notice? I mean, remember, the first battle they did fight was because somebody said, oh, look at that, it's a bunch of easy pickings. And they go try and take their water from the rock, right? It doesn't go well for them. I think God's plan always has been that he would fight our battles if we would just let him.
Big if.
That's a big if, yeah. If we would let him is a big if, because we often feel like we have to take things into our own hands, don't we? God, why don't you just do something?
Our way.
What?
Our way.
Our way, yeah. Any other thoughts on that section? So as we move forward, we need to remember what God's plan A is. God's plan A was, I will do the fighting for you. I will make a way. I will prepare the place for you. And those who aren't with me, I will drive them out. Notice he said, drive them out. He didn't say kill them. Even in the punishment of removing them from the land, he's not taking away the chance that they could turn to him. You ever thought, or
It just struck me what you said. Yeah. You know, the whole, their nation, as you were talking earlier, I thought, well, like the Egyptians, some of the Egyptians went with them.
some of the Egyptians, yes.
So it just struck me.
And some of the Egyptians went with them, and the Egyptians that God destroyed were only people who refused to listen to what he told them to do. The people who followed in the sea were working against God. It's not that God wanted to kill them. The people who died in the diseases and the plagues back in Egypt. God gave fair warning on what needed to happen. Remember, there was a couple of them where Moses told Pharaoh, pull your servants and your slaves in, pull your animals in. This is not going to be good. Don't leave them outside. Did they listen? No. What happened? They died. But isn't the God of the Old Testament a wrathful God? Isn't he a vengeful God? Maybe not, right? God wants, in the New Testament, what does it say? God wants that none should perish. He just keeps giving us opportunities to turn to him. And since God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, that is true of God in the New Testament, and that is true of God in the Old Testament. And there should be evidence of that, right? And we just read it. I'm not going to kill them. I'm going to drive them out. I'm going to use my power, my authority to drive them out in such a way that they know that it's me that's driving them out. And if they choose to submit to me, if they choose to become Israel, one who wrestles with God, then they're welcome back in. A little different from how we get told the story, isn't it?
Or how other people think they interpret it.
Or how other people, yeah, exactly. Move on to the next chapter.
Covered more tonight, we have more.
Well, those laws were a little bit, we had to dig a little bit. 24, 1 and 2. Then he said to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar. Moses alone shall come near to the Lord, but the others shall not come near, and the people shall not come up with him. Okay, setting stage. Anything you want to discuss on that?
Mine says 70 of the elders, so are we assuming there was more?
I would assume there probably was more. The 70 key leaders. So Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and then the 70 key leaders of Israel. Anything? Okay. 3 through 8. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Press and pause. Why do I doubt that? Sorry.
Well, because the whole time they questioned
Right.
what Moses had said.
Yep. Pick it back up, verse 4. And Moses wrote down all the words of the Lord. He rose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the people of Israel who offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen to the Lord. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half the blood he threw against the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do, and we will be obedient. And Moses took the blood and threw it on the people and said, behold the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words.
Okay, verse 7, where they say, we will obey, I call bull.
Have good intentions?
Yeah, at least we can say that much for it. They do it. I'm certain they intend to try and follow it. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, because if I'm too hard on them, then I've got to be really hard on myself. I have the best of intentions most days. Some days I actually follow those intentions part of the way down the road.
There you go, squirrel.
So what else do you notice, or what questions does this section make you ask?
Okay. He had Moses bring the 70 elders, the other 3, but yet he only allowed Moses to come near him. To me, that kind of confuses me. Why didn't he allow the others?
I think it goes back to what happened in chapter 20, where he calls them all the way up to the base of the mountain, and he starts speaking to them, and they all back up. And they say, no, God, don't speak to us, speak to us through Moses. So I think that there's a sense in which having Moses come closer is God honoring what they have asked.
At least the others can say, we witnessed him go up there and.
Right.
But that happened.
Oh, jump ahead. Anything else?
Moses wrote down everything the Lord had said, and he wrote it in a book. Then he took the book of the covenant. Did they have writing then? Did they have alphabet? Did they?
So they did have a form of language, written language. And we do know that Moses was trained in the language and writing of Egypt as a member of Pharaoh's household and someone who was, so he would have had that ability for certain. They have found,
He did shorthand.
they have found, Melissa, can you do a quick search on Google and look for the Joshua tablet? I think that's what they call it. You may have to share your screen with them here in a little bit. Tablet. Go to images. Yeah. Okay, so see that one with the hand right there? That little tablet was found in Israel recently. And it's found on one of the 2 mountains that are mentioned in the book of Joshua, where once they came into the land, they were to put half the people on one mountain and half the people on the other mountain. And that they were supposed to read this list of blessings, where if you follow God, you get these blessings. And then they were supposed to read this list of cursings. And that tablet right there, scroll down and see if it has the words. It kind of does look like a communion wafer. So here you go, right here. This tablet says on it that you saw how small that tablet was, about the size of a quarter. It says, cursed, 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 cursed by the God Yahweh. You will die cursed, cursed will you surely die, cursed by Yahweh, cursed, cursed, cursed. That's what that little tablet says. And many archaeologists and scholars believe that this was, and it's dated to about the right time, or when Joshua entered the land 40 years after this moment. Now, it's little bitty language. I mean, think of it's, and to us, it looks more like scratches. Their letters are, it's a very primitive form of Hebrew, but it's there nonetheless. So yeah, I think Joshua or Moses actually did write this down. Now, I don't think it was a book, because you don't have books until after the time of Christ. It's actually Christians who start using and creating books. Because we had all these scrolls from the Old Testament and all these letters from the New Testament, we get tired of carrying around a bunch of scrolls. And so they find a way to create codexes, is what they used to call them. And the first books were about the first couple hundred years after Christ. But I believe absolutely Moses wrote this down. It was probably on a parchment, a scroll, though it could have been like that on a tablet of stone. You know, of course, if that little square had all that on it, then to write what we just had there, it's gonna be a nice big chunk of stone. Which is why they believe the Ten Commandments were written on stone, by the way. Most common. Probably what it was a nice big block of clay that they could mark and write on, and then as it dried, it solidified. Any other thoughts?
Jerry Jones, I think you kind of surpassed that.
Can I-
conversation, but
Where's Don's at? Oh,
Jerry Bone,
scared of direct face-to-face with the Holy God. I think that's absolutely true. I mean, they've seen God do all kinds of stuff, and he just threatened to drive out anybody who wasn't of them. So I think there's a sense in which the people are still very much afraid of God. I mean, if God showed up today in all his glory, who wouldn't be a little bit afraid?
Patrick.
Petrified. Any other thoughts or questions on 3 through 8? I know there's some out there. No one wants to ask the question about the blood?
I was thinking,
Just,
That's behind Harry. I think it's a splashes.
what do you think?
it says he splattered half of it over the people. And the rest he threw at the altar.
is that like the Catholic priest where they go through the holy water and
There is an essence in which, yes, that is a symbolism of the being immersed. Not very many Catholic churches do that anymore. A lot more Eastern Orthodox churches still do that, where they'll put the holy water in this thing and they'll kind of basically sling it at everybody. And it's meant to be an image of this, but what's going on here? What do you think? I think there's a sense in which, yeah, it's a blessing, but why blood? Who wants to be splattered with blood?
Well, because they were gonna sacrifice the animals, so maybe,
Okay, so it's definitely tied to the sacrifice.
That prelude to Christ's blood.
So, yes. So we can take our notion of our understanding as Christ's blood and bring it back into this, because the notion that we have of Christ's blood stems from this. You could not we don't do it this way anymore. In fact, when you signed the documents the other day and took out the loan, there was no blood spilled. But it used to be that you.
that's what I was
Thinking, he does wear a lot of bandages.
But it used to be that twofold. One, you could not have any treaty that was not signed in blood. We have that phrase, right? That makes it somehow more binding if it's signed in blood. Now, part of that was because there was a notion that you killed an animal to say anyone who breaks this treaty is going to have this happen to him. You're as good as dead if you break this treaty. There's some symbolism there. The other side of it is that there is a sense in which these people are being made gods, and there's a price that has to be paid for that. And so, do you want to be underneath that covering, which is why the blood is spilled over the people? And part of it is given to the altar because the altar is the representation of God's side of the contract. Does that make sense? So half of it goes to God, half of it goes to the people. So if the contract is saying, if you break this contract, you're as good as dead, and it's being poured over the people and being poured over God, will God break the contract? He won't. He doesn't. Never has, never will. Do we? And what happens? Well, we all die, don't we?
Ink is more readily available than ink.
And blood was definitely more readily available than ink. They actually didn't have many inks at this point. They didn't have a lot of dyes like we do today. In fact, iron gall ink is one of the oldest inks that we know of, and it's just barely around 1,500, 2,000 years old. Maybe a little older than that, but it's not easy to make. And so blood was easier to write with than anything else. Because when it might go on red, but when it dries, it's.
Does, forgiveness come in here anywhere for blood? Because aren't we have they had sacrifices to bring the sacrifice of lamb or whatever for forgiveness of sins.
So there's a sense of that, but notice what it says, the sacrifices that were given here were for a peace offering and a burnt offering. There's a sense in which the burnt offering was to draw you close to God, and the peace offering was to acknowledge that you want to be made right with God. And so these two offerings are invoked here because people are drawing near to God for the sake of this covenant, and they're being set right with God through this covenant. And God says, so long as you stay in right relationship with me, I'm going to enact everything that I've told you. I'll drive out your enemies. I'll make sure you have no disease. I'll make sure you don't have illness, and I'll make sure you don't have any miscarriages. I will fight against your enemies. I will fight against your adversaries. Anybody like that deal? I'd say sign me up. Any other thoughts? Oh, we're good. Verse 9 through 11. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. There was under his feet, as it were, a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. And he did not lay his hand on the chief men of the people of Israel. They beheld God and ate and drank. Any thoughts? Questions? In this moment, they are right enough with God that they actually get to see Him. That's pretty cool. For a brief second here, there's hope, Mindy. They're right for now.
I'm like stuck on that word sapphire. I'm kind of looking because
Okay.
and I think it's because I've read things about like golden roads and I don't know, they haven't really talked a lot about Eden, but I've read things about jewels, things being jeweled emeralds and sapphires and diamonds and rubies and I don't know, the word sapphire just stuck out to me.
Okay, so what are you thinking? What's your question?
Well, the things I've read is that is like heaven. There's colors that are in heaven that we don't see here, that you know, not all our senses are opened and approved, I guess is how I want to say that. But it's like they're getting a glimpse of beauty that they haven't seen.
I think that's absolutely true. This notion that they are getting a glimpse of beauty that they have not seen and will not see here on earth. The other side of it is, some of it is the grandeur of God is so big that something like a sapphire, which to us is worth a lot of money, He's paved his floor with it. Put that into perspective. And that's what I think it's the imagery of in Revelation saying, where the streets are paved with gold. So in other words, we're going to empty Fort Knox, and Fort Knox probably only has enough gold to get from Fort Knox to Louisville if they're lucky. And that's at a footpath width. And here is God who has paved his floor with sapphires. And no, rephrase that. Not sapphires, plural, a sapphire, period. One giant big sapphire.
It makes you think of like stained glass, like how beautiful
Oh, yeah.
stained glass is. Imagine beauty we haven't seen yet.
So, yeah, exactly. And that's what's meant, I think that's exactly what this is trying to evoke. The beauty, we all in our head can kind of picture a pretty sapphire. Most of them are little bitty, right? Now imagine a huge one that God is using just as carpet. And carpet can be nice. I mean, this doesn't look too bad. It's got some stains on it, but I don't spend a whole lot of time examining the carpet. I spend more time examining the things on the carpet, right? And so if you are enamored with the glory that is the carpet, then in theory, what's on the carpet and what walks on the carpet should be all the more glorious. And Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and these 70 elders all got to experience that.
Maybe says,
My translation says lapis lazuli instead of sapphire. Yeah, that, of course, for those who don't know what lapis lazuli is, it's the blue stone that you see all the time in Egyptian, Middle Eastern jewelry. It's this deep blue. You've been looking for it. Go for it.
Yeah, is that why the Global Methodist chose lapis lazuli for their color?
It might have, I don't, it's meant that stone has always been symbolic of the sky, the deep blue of a clear sky. And to be able to track that in your hand was why that stone was almost appraised more than even gold for a while. Now, but again, same notion, Amy, that it's, this rare stone that everybody's fighting over. Yeah, I used that to carpet my floor. There's anybody in here watch the Marvel movies? Anybody else? No. For 20 years, they were building up this story about these Infinity Stones and how important they were. And then there's this show that they just put out, and I'm ruining it for anybody who hasn't seen it, but then there's a guy who has a drawer filled with the Infinity Stones. They're fighting over these things and they're so powerful. And it's just like, oh, wait, maybe they're not that important. And kind of that image is what I got. People long for gold. We want gold. And God's like, yeah, I used to pave my streets. Not a big deal. You want sapphires? You want rubies? You want emeralds? Yeah, I use them to tile my floor.
Maybe that's to show that what we deem as worthy and important is.
Could we have wrong priorities?
Never.
Yeah.
No, I.
Anybody we just came out of Thanksgiving, right? Anybody want to go sit down and have Thanksgiving dinner at the table with God? If he's the host of the table? Got something, Charles?
I was thinking how honored and privileged they were By the way, we never hear this story talked about. That it wasn't just Moses who saw God. All of these people saw God. And how many people say, I wish I saw God? If I could just see God, it'd make a difference. Jumping in here, how many of these people made it in the promised land?
Joshua and Caleb,
They weren't there.
we don't know that they weren't part of the 70. But any other thoughts?
Maybe two. Maybe.
Maybe two. Out of the 74 who got to see God, maybe 2 of them followed him enough to actually enter the promised land. Verse 12 through 14. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the command, which I have written for their instruction." So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God. And he said to the other elders, "Wait here for us until we return to you. And behold, Aaron and Hur are with you. Whoever has a dispute, let him go to them." So Joshua was one of them. What else do you notice? What questions?
Makes you wonder if Moses thought that he might not come back. If he put Aaron and Hur technically in charge.
Bare minimum, he doesn't think he's coming back this afternoon. He thinks he's going to be gone for a little bit. Gone long enough, I better put somebody in charge or you guys are going to get rowdy. Mom's going to the grocery store. Oldest is in charge.
And that worked out for everyone.
And that worked out for nobody. What else do you notice? I think there's a sense in which I'm hopeful. A lot of leadership ink has been spilt over this, that Moses, from an early stage of his leadership, saw, I need to be getting somebody else trained to be able to go after me. And so there's been a lot of ink spilt about how Moses brings Joshua along from a very early stage to say, you need to be seeing this. You need to be a part of this.
That's interesting. My gut was he took him with him because Moses maybe was aging and needed help.
And that very well could be too. I mean, we were introduced to Joshua a couple chapters back that he was a young fighting man. You know, he was one of the generals for him. But here, Joshua isn't a general. He's being used as a scribe, an assistant, an administrative assistant.
And Aaron was what you maybe would consider second in command, so he didn't want to take him up.
So he doesn't take the second in command. That's a good point. You know,
He takes his secretary.
he takes his secretary.
That's a big no-no just for.
They're the same gender. It's not, you know. I've just always found it interesting that Moses did bring anybody along. And notice, Moses brought him along and God let him live. There's that nice little piece there, remember? Why is that?
Well, he didn't go all the way up, but yeah, he took it to the edge.
12. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, that I may give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction." So Moses rose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went into the mountain of God. Joshua went with him.
I'm getting ahead to another spot.
Keep going, finish, we're gonna finish another chapter? We are on a roll. 15 through 18. Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the seventh day, he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain. And Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights.
Some meaningful numbers there.
Yeah, those are some pretty common numbers, aren't they? When was the last time we saw 40 days and 40 nights? Flood. What happened during the flood? God washed away everything and started something new. But there's no symbolism in that at all, right?
Well, then you have the 6 days, and on the seventh day, the Lord came to him, which was
On the seventh day, God called out to Moses from the midst of the cloud.
So it's a fire, it's a cloud and then a fire?
A cloud filled with fire descends on the top of the mountain. Moses and Joshua go up to meet it. It's sitting there for 6 days. On the seventh day, God calls out, and then they go up in, and they're there for 40 days and 40 nights.
Do you think the Israelite people thought that Moses was dead because he went into that fire?
That could probably be a legitimate thought.
I'm wondering, why fire? When you think of fire, you know, it doesn't bring safety to mind, it brings danger.
And yet, haven't they been following a pillar of fire for the last 2 months? Wasn't a fire on a bush that called out to Moses the first time? Maybe we have the wrong understanding of fire.
Or.
Fire brings new life though too.
I remember you're talking about that in the line from the line which the Lord wrote about Aslan. Oh, he's not a tame lion. You know, we're not saying that he's safe, but he's good.
God is not safe, but God is good. And in this instance, God has brought them through so much, and he's showing himself as a consuming fire, right? The whole top of the mountain is consumed with this fire and cloud. So I think there's probably something to what you're saying. You know, Joyce, that I'm certain after a couple of days, people start to wonder, and after 40 days, people think, well, he's dead and gone.
So where did the imagery of hell and fire come in?
Dante's Inferno. But it's actually more of a picture from Greek mythology than biblical stories. There is a lake of fire, but when they talk about the place of the dead or hell in general, they tend to more talk about it being a place of deep blackness where nothing is seen. Jesus does allude to Gehenna, the valley of Gehenna, which was essentially a trash pit that was burning all the time. And so they somewhat become synonymous. Hell becomes this deep, dark place with burning, unquenchable fire. But the thing of it is unquenchable fire is almost always used of God. Which is probably where the Catholic Church came up with the notion of purgatory. A place where God would purify you until you were good enough to get in there. Because fire is often God's image, not an image of the evil one or his domain. Any other thoughts? Yes. Got one? Patience, Chris says, patience. We got 10 minutes. Do we want to hop into the next chapter or do we need to leave it there?
I was just thinking, what would happen if you disappeared for 40 days?
Well, good luck, Charles.
No, I'm with you here, because
You're not my secretary. Apparently Amber and I are going to disappear for 40 days.
That'd be a
It's
whole-
giving me an evil look already.
I think I know where you're going.
Gotta find what the
maybe it's you and Steve are going out for 40 days.
Why me?
You'll never make it.
If you try a scooter, you just gotta find a hill.
Long
You know, I think this is an interesting place to stop. I don't really want to grab into the next section, but I think it's worth noting this reality that they're gone for 40 days. They saw them up on the side of the mountain for 6 days, and on the seventh day they go in. They know that they're there, and then it's 47 days. I'm wondering if Joshua brought enough provisions, because he's the assistant, right? Assistant better bring the provisions. Of course, then there's also the section we just read where Moses and Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders all went and feasted at God's table. So maybe God's got the provisions. There's a lot of unknowns sitting here right now, aren't there?
Kind of like staying at a Holiday Inn Express, there's always a breakfast.
Sometimes a breakfast is worth eating and sometimes it's not, but it's there. I think that that reality is something to keep in mind as we move forward because of what's about ready to happen. There's probably some there that are going to get afraid that Moses is gone.
Do you think Moses up there in the mountain, the people don't see him for 40 days, 40 nights, but when you're with God, there is no time?
You know, I've been having that thought in the back of my head all the way through this because, you know, Moses might have been with God for what he felt like was just a couple of minutes. And then he leaves God's presence and, oh crap, it's been 40 days. And just so you know what happens next, what are they doing down there with that stupid golden cow? But that's
Joshua was saying, hey, I think they're at war.
something's going on down there, Moses. We got to go figure this thing out.
See, you could get down the hill a lot faster in Steve's scooter.
We're going to press stop there. And unless there's a final thought, then I'll pray. Let's pray. God, we marvel at the notion of just how grand you are. And not just how grand you are, but Lord, that you would see fit to invite us into your plan. And not just your plan, but into your family. And to sit at your table and to feast with you. Lord, that you are the same God today as you were when you came as Christ to live amongst us. And as the same God that you were in this moment as you invited Moses and his friends to feast with you. You are a good God who has a good plan for us. Lord, may we not just assent and say, yes, we will follow you, but Lord, may we truly do it. May people not look at us and want to call bull when we make commitments to follow you. And Lord, when the world looks at us, may they see you and us so clearly that they want to follow you too. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Next Thursday, we will pick up with chapter 25.